There's a peculiar moment that arrives in every person's life when they realize the pain they've been carrying should have ended long ago. Yet somehow it remains, as if cemented into the very structure of who they are. You've likely felt it, that quiet bewilderment watching others move forward while you remain anchored to the same memories, the same questions, the same ache that refuses to dissolve no matter how much time passes. Most of us operate under a deeply ingrained assumption that healing follows a linear path, that if we just give ourselves enough days, enough months, enough analysis, the wound will eventually close on its own. But what if this assumption itself is the very mechanism keeping you trapped? What if the act of processing, revisiting, and dissecting your pain is precisely what prevents it from releasing its grip? Depth psychology reveals a truth that overturns everything we've been taught about emotional recovery. The human psyche operates according to laws that have nothing to do with clock time. When you repeatedly return to a memory, when you analyze it from every angle, when you ask yourself the same questions for the 1,000th time, you aren't healing, you're feeding. You're supplying psychological energy to an image that should have faded long ago. And in doing so, you're guaranteeing its survival. This video isn't designed for those seeking a gentle, gradual release that feels comfortable and controlled. It's for those who sense something different is possible, who are willing to confront what they've been unintentionally sustaining, and who want to understand how letting go can happen with such speed that it leaves even them momentarily breathless. What follows may unsettle you, not because it's harsh, but because it will reveal how much of what you've called healing has actually been maintenance. 1. The withdrawal of psychological fuel. There exists in psychological thought a principle so simple that most people overlook it entirely, yet it governs everything about why some remain stuck, while others transform with startling speed. Nothing in the inner world maintains its power simply because it happened. Events themselves possess no inherent psychological weight. The weight is added by what you do after the event has passed. This is the distinction most never grasp. You are not suffering because of what occurred. You are suffering because of what you continue to do in response to what occurred. Abstract visuals of repeating patterns. Think of it this way. Imagine a room containing a single candle. The flame is small, contained, incapable of illuminating much on its own. But if you stand before that candle and hold a mirror behind it, suddenly the light multiplies, reflects, fills spaces it could never reach alone. The candle is the original event. The mirror is your attention. And most people spend years holding mirrors behind flames that should have burned out naturally, wondering why their inner world remains so brightly lit by pain. From the perspective of analytical psychology, the mind operates through an economy of energy that Jung referred to as psychic libido, not sexual energy in the narrow sense, but the fundamental life force that attaches to images, thoughts, and experiences. Whatever this energy flows toward grows in psychological mass. Whatever it withdraws from diminishes. This isn't metaphor, it's the actual mechanics of how consciousness functions. When you repeatedly return to a memory, when you replay conversations, when you imagine alternate outcomes, you are transferring energy from your present life into a past that exists only as an image. And images fed regularly become centers of gravity that begin to shape your perception of everything else. What makes this difficult to recognize is that the mind possesses a natural inclination toward the familiar. Even when the familiar is painful, even when it drains you, even when you consciously wish to move beyond it, there's a part of the psyche that treats the known as safe, simply because it's known. This creates a paradoxical situation where people actively maintain their own suffering without realizing they're doing so. They believe they're working through something when they're actually circling it. They believe they're seeking closure when they're repeatedly reopening the same wound to examine it one more time. Consider the difference between looking at a photograph and living inside it. Examining a memory with the intention of understanding is like glancing at a photograph. You see it, you note it, you place it down. But most people don't glance. They move into the photograph. They begin to inhabit it. They walk through its rooms, touch its objects, have conversations with people who aren't there. This is the distinction between acknowledgement and occupation. An occupation requires constant energy. I once encountered a man named Daniel who had spent 3 years trying to understand why a particular friendship had ended. He believed that if he could just analyze it thoroughly enough, he would eventually reach a point of clarity that would free him. But each time he analyzed, he felt worse. Each time he thought he'd made progress, the pain returned within days. What Daniel didn't see was that his analysis was actually a form of ritual. He would sit in the same chair, at the same time of evening, and mentally walk through every detail of the falling out. He believed he was healing. He was feeding. Jungian psychology reveals that the unconscious doesn't distinguish between an event occurring in external reality and an event being vividly recreated internally. To the psyche, repeated attention equals continued existence. This is why people can suffer for decades over things that happened in hours. Not because the event was that powerful, but because they've extended its life through daily contributions of energy. The shift that allows letting go to accelerate happens when you begin to recognize that not every thought requires completion. A memory surfaces. The old impulse says, examine it, understand it, figure out why it still hurts. But there's another possibility, simply noticing that the memory has appeared and choosing not to follow it. This isn't suppression. Suppression is active pushing away, which also requires energy. This is something different. This is the quiet decision to stop investing, like ceasing to add logs to a fire and simply watching what remains burn down on its own. What makes this frightening is that when you stop feeding, something unexpected appears. Not relief immediately, not peace. First comes emptiness. The space previously occupied by constant mental activity suddenly becomes quiet, and in that quiet, a question arises that terrifies many. If I'm not thinking about this, who am I? If I'm not consumed by this story, what fills my days? This emptiness is not a problem to be solved. It's a necessary passage. It's the psyche learning that it can exist without being constantly occupied. The fear that emerges at this stage isn't evidence you're doing something wrong. It's evidence you're doing something right. You're withdrawing energy from a structure that's been standing for so long it felt permanent. And when structures begin to crumble, even the ones that imprisoned us, the collapse creates tremors. Stay with the tremor. Don't rebuild. Let the emptiness be empty long enough to discover that emptiness isn't the same as nothingness. Emptiness is space, and space is what allows something new to eventually arrive. 2. The mask you mistook for yourself. There exists a particular kind of suffering that people misidentify constantly. They believe they're attached to a person, an outcome, a version of the past, but beneath that surface attachment lies something far more entrenched. An identity, a role, a carefully constructed mask that has been worn so long it fused with the skin. Letting go becomes terrifying not because of what you'll lose externally, but because of who you'll no longer be internally. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung gave this phenomenon a name that has since entered common language, though its deeper implications are rarely understood. He called it the persona. In ancient theater, actors wore masks to project specific characters to the audience. The mask wasn't the actor, but it was what the audience saw and responded to. In psychological life, each person develops a persona, a collection of roles, behaviors, and self-presentations designed to navigate the social world. The persona is necessary. It allows you to function, to relate, to be recognized. The problem begins when you forget you're wearing it. When identification with the persona becomes complete, You no longer experience yourself as someone playing a role. You experience yourself as the role. And roles, by their nature, require maintenance. They require situations that confirm them, relationships that reflect them, outcomes that validate them. This is why some people cannot let go of situations that objectively harm them, because the situation has become the stage on which their persona performs. Ask yourself a question that may feel uncomfortable. If tomorrow you were no longer the person who carries everyone else's burdens, who would you be? If you stopped being the one who always understands, who never gets angry, who holds things together, what would remain? If you were no longer the victim of circumstances, the fighter who overcomes, the one who never gives up, if all of that dissolved, would there be anyone left? Most people cannot answer this question, and that inability to answer is precisely what keeps them trapped. I worked with a woman named Patricia, whose entire adult life had been organized around being indispensable. At work, she was the person who handled every crisis. In her family, she was the one everyone turned to. In friendships, she was the listener, the giver, the one who asked nothing for herself. When she began therapy, she described a profound exhaustion she couldn't explain. She had everything she'd worked for: respect, responsibility, people who depended on her. But she felt empty. What emerged over months of conversation was something Patricia had never considered. Her entire sense of worth derived from being needed. Without someone needing her, she didn't know how to value herself. The exhaustion wasn't from overwork alone. It was from the constant vigilance required to maintain a role that had no off switch. She couldn't let go of situations that drained her, because letting go would mean stepping out of the only identity she knew. This is the hidden architecture of attachment. People stay in draining relationships not because they love the other person, but because the role of the one who loves unconditionally gives them a sense of meaning. People remain in jobs they've outgrown, not because they can't find others, but because the identity of the dedicated professional has become who they are. People hold on to grievances, not because justice requires it, but because being the one who was wronged provides a coherent story about their place in the world. Jung wrote that the persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask, designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. The concealment is what matters here. When you're living entirely through persona, your true nature doesn't disappear. It goes underground. It becomes the shadow. And the shadow, neglected, grows restless. The moment of letting go accelerates dramatically when you begin to see your own persona in operation. Not to judge it, not to tear it down, but simply to observe it as something you've been wearing, rather than something you are. In a triggering situation, when you feel the old impulse to please, to control, to perform, pause for just a few seconds. Ask quietly, which mask is activating right now? The good one? The strong one? The one who's fine no matter what? Just name it. No need to change anything yet. This act of naming creates what psychologists call cognitive distance. You're no longer identical with the role. You're someone observing the role. And observation, sustained over time, begins to loosen the role's grip. You start to notice that the mask requires you to react in certain ways, to feel certain things, to protect certain images. And with that noticing comes a choice you didn't have before, the choice to respond differently, or not to respond at all. The fear that arises when the persona begins to thin is natural. For decades, that mask kept you safe. It helped you belong. It earned you love, or at least approval. Letting it fade feels like standing without protection. But what you discover, if you stay with the discomfort, is that what lies beneath the mask isn't weakness. It's something far more substantial. It's the part of you that existed before you learned to perform. And that part doesn't need to be needed. It doesn't need to be right. It doesn't need to be recognized. It simply needs to live. When Patricia began to see her indispensable persona as something she'd constructed rather than something she was, a strange thing happened. She didn't suddenly become selfish or uncaring. She became more discriminating about where she placed her care. She began to notice when she was helping from genuine desire versus helping from automatic role fulfillment. She started to let some situations handle themselves. And in the space created by her non-intervention, she discovered that others were more capable than she'd believed, and that she was more than her usefulness. Letting go of a role isn't loss. It's the end of a performance that exhausted you. And when the performance ends, what's left is not emptiness. It's the possibility of an authentic life, one chosen rather than inherited. 3. The architecture of repetition. There's a reason why insight alone rarely produces lasting change. You can understand your patterns completely, trace their origins, articulate their consequences, and still find yourself repeating them the moment circumstances trigger familiar responses. This isn't failure of will or lack of sincerity. It's the overlooked power of habit, not habit understood as simple routines, but habit as the invisible architecture that organizes your daily psychological existence. Jung observed that human beings are governed less by logic than by the need for psychological continuity. The psyche craves predictability because predictability feels like safety, even when what's predictable is suffering. This creates a binding mechanism that operates below conscious awareness. You don't decide to remain attached to pain. You simply continue the habits that keep that pain alive, and the habits do the rest. Consider what your typical day contains. The moments upon waking, when the mind reaches instinctively for familiar thoughts. The spaces between activities, when old mental loops automatically resume. The late night hours, when defenses lower and the same images play again. These aren't choices you're making. They're grooves worn into the psyche by years of repetition. And grooves, once deep enough, direct the flow of water without any effort from the water itself. This explains a phenomenon that frustrates countless people seeking change. They attend workshops, read books, have breakthroughs, feel transformed, and then return to their ordinary lives, only to find that within weeks, the old feelings have reclaimed their territory. The breakthrough was real, the insight was accurate, but the architecture of daily life remained unchanged. And architecture always outlasts inspiration. The biblical narrative of the Israelites wandering in the desert contains a psychological truth that transcends its religious origins. After generations of slavery in Egypt, the people were freed. Yet repeatedly, they expressed a desire to return, not because slavery was preferable, but because the desert, the space of freedom and uncertainty, was more frightening than the prison they knew. They remembered the bread, the onions, the predictable rhythm of bondage. Habit had made even oppression familiar, and familiarity had become their measure of safety. Breaking the habits that maintain attachment doesn't require dramatic upheaval. It requires attention to the small moments where the old rhythm asserts itself. When you wake and the mind reaches for its usual preoccupation, pause, don't engage, don't fight, just notice the reaching and let it be. When emptiness arises and the impulse is to fill it with familiar mental activity, pause. Sit with the emptiness for a few minutes longer than comfortable. When you're alone and the old stories begin their automatic narration, pause. Recognize that you're hearing a recording, not discovering truth. These micro-interruptions are where change actually happens. Not in grand resolutions, but in the accumulated moments of choosing differently, when the old pattern would have run automatically. Each pause is a small withdrawal of energy from the habitual structure. Each moment of not following the familiar thought is a tiny erosion of the groove. What makes this practice difficult is that when you interrupt habit, discomfort immediately arises, not because anything dangerous is happening, but because the nervous system interprets unfamiliarity as threat. Your heart may beat faster. Your mind may generate urgent reasons why you need to return to the old thinking. This is simply the withdrawal response, the psyche protesting the removal of its accustomed fuel. If you interpret this discomfort as evidence you're doing something wrong, you'll stop. If you recognize it as evidence you're doing something right, you'll continue. There's a particular fear that emerges when habits begin to loosen. It's the fear of disorientation, of not knowing what comes next, of living without the constant internal commentary that has filled your awareness for so long. This fear is not a problem, it's a passage. The psyche must learn that it can exist without constant occupation, that silence isn't emptiness, that unfamiliarity isn't danger. And it learns this only through experience, through staying in the discomfort long enough for the nervous system to update its maps. A man named Richard described this process in terms that capture its essence. For years, he had ended each day by mentally reviewing every interaction, searching for mistakes, analyzing what others might have thought of him. This habit consumed hours of his life and generated constant low-grade anxiety. When he first tried to stop, he felt physically agitated, as if something terrible would happen if he didn't complete his review. But he persisted. He sat with the agitation. And gradually, over weeks, he discovered that nothing terrible happened. The agitation faded. Sleep came more easily. And the person he'd been trying to please through his constant analysis, that person, he realized, existed only in his mind. The habits that maintain attachment are not your enemies. They're strategies your psyche developed to manage experience, to create predictability, to maintain a sense of control. But strategies that once served can outlive their usefulness. When you see them clearly, when you understand that they're not you but only things you do, you gain the capacity to choose differently. And choosing differently, repeatedly, across thousands of small moments, gradually transforms the architecture of your inner life, until one day you realize that what once occupied you no longer fits in the space you've become. 4. The geography of self. There's a dimension of letting go that most discussions overlook entirely, yet it may be the most practical and immediately accessible. It concerns not what happens inside you, but where you are when what happens inside you occurs. Human beings are not abstract minds floating through a void. You are embodied, situated, located, and location exerts a force on psychological life that few recognize and fewer still consciously utilize. Think of how you feel when you enter a place connected to significant memories. Perhaps a street where you once lived, a cafe where important conversations happened, a room where something ended. Notice what occurs in your body, the subtle shift in posture, the change in breathing, the sudden emergence of feelings you thought you'd resolved. This isn't imagination. It's the space itself acting as a key, unlocking psychological states that belong to that location. Jung understood that the psyche doesn't exist solely inside the skull. It extends into environments, attaches to objects, weaves itself into the fabric of places. This is why people can feel completely different in different settings, not because they're pretending, but because different aspects of the self are activated by different spatial contexts. The person you are in your childhood home is not identical to the person you are in a new city. The thoughts that arise in a place of past pain are not the same thoughts that arise elsewhere. The implication for letting go is both simple and challenging. If certain spaces consistently trigger old patterns, old feelings, old versions of yourself, then remaining in those spaces while trying to change is like trying to dry yourself while staying in the rain. You can want to be dry with all your heart. You can visualize dryness, affirm dryness, understand the psychology of wetness. But as long as you remain in the rain, you will stay wet. This isn't about blame or weakness. It's about respecting how human beings are actually structured. You have a nervous system designed to respond to environmental cues. Those cues operate below conscious awareness, shaping your state before you have a chance to choose. When you repeatedly encounter cues associated with past pain, your system will repeatedly activate that pain. Not because you're failing to heal, but because you're asking your body to be somewhere it learned to suffer, while expecting it to respond differently. A woman named Eleanor shared a story that illustrates this principle with painful clarity. After a difficult divorce, she remained in the house she'd shared with her former partner. She told herself this was practical, that moving would be disruptive, that she could handle the memories. But month after month, she found herself unable to move forward. Every room contained triggers. Every corner held a reminder. She would feel fine at work, fine with friends, but the moment she walked through her front door, the old weight returned. She began to blame herself. She thought she wasn't trying hard enough, wasn't healing properly, was secretly holding on to the past. It took a therapist to point out what should have been obvious. She was asking herself to recover in an environment designed to keep her sick. The house wasn't neutral space. It was a museum of her marriage. And museums exist to preserve, not to transform. When Eleanor finally moved, the change wasn't immediate, but it was real. In a new apartment with no shared history, she found herself thinking less about the past. Not because she'd done more work, but because the work no longer had to fight against constant environmental opposition. The new space gave her nervous system a chance to reset, to form new associations, to exist without being perpetually reminded of what had been. Leaving spaces that hold you isn't always as dramatic as moving cities. Sometimes it means changing your route to avoid a street that weighs on you. Sometimes it means working in a different room, sleeping on a different side of the bed, rearranging furniture so the space no longer mirrors the past. Sometimes it means simply acknowledging that a particular place has done its job, and you're allowed to stop visiting. What's difficult about this is the guilt that often accompanies it. People feel they should be able to handle any environment, that needing to leave is a sign of weakness, that the past shouldn't have that much power. But this guilt misunderstands how humans work. You wouldn't expect a plant to thrive in soil that poisoned it. You wouldn't blame a cut for not healing while you continued to reopen it. Space matters because you matter. And you matter as a physical being, not just a collection of thoughts. There's a particular fear that arises when you leave a familiar space, even one associated with pain. The unfamiliar is disorienting. You don't know how to be in new surroundings because the old surroundings told you how to be. In a new place, you have to discover yourself again, without the cues that previously defined you. This disorientation can feel like loss, but it's actually freedom. Freedom from the automatic activation of old patterns. Freedom to respond to the present rather than reliving the past. When you change your environment, you're not running away. You're creating conditions under which genuine change becomes possible. You're acknowledging that the past exists in places as much as in memories, and that removing yourself from those places is not avoidance but wisdom. The most frightening moment isn't leaving. It's the moment you realize how much lighter you feel afterward. Because that lightness reveals how heavy everything was, and how long you carried it unnecessarily. 5. The companion you never invited. There comes a point in genuine letting go that most people try to bypass. It's the point where all the familiar strategies have been withdrawn, all the roles have been seen through, all the environmental triggers have been addressed, and what remains is something unexpected. Not peace, but fear. Not relief, but a kind of naked dread that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. This fear is not a sign of regression. It's not evidence that letting go was wrong. It's the emergence of something that has been present all along, waiting in the background, never fully experienced because you were always too occupied to notice it. Jung called this the shadow. Not evil, not pathology, but simply the parts of yourself that never got to live, that were pushed aside, denied expression, left in the dark so that the persona could shine. When you stop feeding old patterns, when you withdraw from familiar roles, when you leave spaces that held you, the shadow begins to stir. It's been waiting. It knows that your distraction is ending, that your constant occupation is ceasing, that finally there may be room for what was never allowed. And its first appearance is often frightening because it comes in forms you don't recognize. Anger you thought you'd transcended, neediness you believed you'd outgrown, vulnerability you'd successfully hidden. Most people, at this juncture, do something that seems reasonable, but actually extends their suffering. They interpret the emergence of shadow material as a problem to be solved. They try to understand it, fix it, make it go away. They return to analysis, to self-improvement, to the familiar pattern of treating themselves as projects to be completed. But the shadow doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be met. There's research in neuroscience that illuminates what's happening here. When a person stays with a feared sensation without avoiding it, without trying to escape, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, gradually reduces its response. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for conscious awareness and regulation, begins to regain influence. Fear doesn't destroy you. Running from fear is what gives it power. Staying with fear, simply staying, allowing it to be present without acting on it, teaches the nervous system that the threat is not actual. Consider what it means to stay with fear in practical terms. You're sitting alone. The old distractions have been withdrawn. There's no mental loop to run, no role to perform, no familiar pain to occupy you. And what arises is a kind of formless anxiety, a sense that something is wrong, that you should be doing something, that if you're not careful, something terrible will happen. The impulse is to move, to do, to think, to escape this internal silence. Staying means not moving, not doing, not thinking your way out. It means sitting in the car during the rain, as the metaphor goes, with no music, no phone, no destination. Just listening to the rain hit the glass and feeling whatever arises in your body. Not analyzing it, not naming it, not trying to change it, just being present with it. This is terrifying because you've probably never done it. Your entire life has been organized around avoiding this moment, around keeping busy, keeping occupied, keeping the inner noise loud enough to drown out whatever waits in the quiet. But what waits in the quiet is not a monster. It's parts of you that were never allowed to speak. And they don't speak in words. They speak in sensations, in sudden emotions, in images that rise unbidden. A man named Thomas discovered this when he finally stopped his decades-long pattern of constant achievement. He had built a successful career, a respected reputation, a life that looked admirable from outside. But inside, he was exhausted. When he began to withdraw from the relentless pursuit of external validation, he didn't feel peaceful. He felt terrified. A voice emerged that he'd never heard clearly. If you're not achieving, you're nothing. If you're not succeeding, you don't exist. Thomas's first impulse was to start achieving again, to prove the voice wrong by accumulating more success. But he stayed. He sat with the terror of worthlessness. He let it wash through him without acting on it. And gradually, something shifted. The terror didn't disappear, but it changed. It became less urgent, less overwhelming. And beneath it, Thomas began to sense something he'd never encountered, a sense of his own existence that didn't depend on what he did. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This isn't a prescription for obsession with darkness. It's an acknowledgement that light and dark belong to the same whole, that you cannot have one without the other, that the attempt to be only light leaves you fragmented, incomplete, perpetually fleeing from half yourself. When you stay with fear, you're not overcoming it. You're integrating it. You're allowing the shadow to emerge from the basement of your psyche and take its place in the full spectrum of your being. And when the shadow is no longer exiled, it no longer needs to scream for attention. It becomes what it always was, a part of you, neither good nor bad, simply part. The letting go that frightens you most is not loss. It's the approach of wholeness. The ego, which has spent your entire life maintaining boundaries, keeping certain things out, preserving a particular self-image, experiences wholeness as threat, because wholeness includes what the ego excluded. But what the ego excluded was never dangerous. It was just inconvenient, uncomfortable, incompatible with the story you were trying to tell. When you can sit with fear without fleeing, without fixing, without fighting, something fundamental reorganizes itself. The energy previously spent on avoidance becomes available. The attention previously devoted to keeping the shadow at bay is freed. And in that freedom, you begin to experience a kind of presence that requires no performance, no protection, no proof. You're just here. And being here is enough. 6. The return of energy. If you've remained with this exploration to its final stage, something has already shifted, whether you feel it or not. The very act of following these ideas to their conclusion represents a willingness to consider that letting go might be different than you assumed. Not a gradual fading, but a reorientation so fundamental that it changes the conditions under which everything else occurs. The culmination of this process isn't forgetting. It's not reaching a state where the past no longer exists in memory. It's something far more significant, becoming someone for whom the past no longer defines the present. And this becoming happens not through fighting the old, but through building something new that simply has no room for what no longer fits. Jung used the term individuation to describe this trajectory. It's the lifelong process of becoming more fully yourself, not according to others' expectations or inherited roles, but according to your own deepest nature. Individuation isn't about adding qualities. It's about stripping away what isn't genuinely yours, until what remains is unmistakably you. And stripping away is exactly what letting go accomplishes. When you withdraw energy from old patterns, from personas that never fit, from spaces that held you back, from fears that ran you, that energy doesn't disappear. It returns to you. It becomes available for something else. This is the principle of conservation of psychological energy. What stops flowing outward begins to accumulate inward. And accumulated energy, over time, becomes something you can feel. It becomes presence. It becomes groundedness. It becomes the quiet confidence that doesn't need to prove itself because it knows itself. The practical question is how to facilitate this accumulation, how to build the inner source of energy that will gradually make old attachments irrelevant. The answer lies in structures, not dramatic transformations, but consistent practices that signal to your psyche that you're serious about change. First, establish rhythms that don't depend on motivation. Sleep at the same time. Wake at the same time. Move your body regularly. Create periods of focused work where distraction is forbidden. These aren't discipline for discipline's sake. They're containers that prevent energy from leaking. When your days have predictable structure, your mind becomes less chaotic. When your body knows what to expect, your nervous system calms, and from calm, clarity emerges naturally. Second, commit to something that requires sustained attention over time. A skill, a study, a creative project that won't be completed quickly. This isn't about achievement. It's about teaching your nervous system that value accumulates through persistence, not through immediate gratification. When you invest energy in something that grows slowly, you're practicing the very capacity that letting go requires, the ability to stay with process without demanding instant results. Third, become selective about what and who you allow into your attention. Every interaction, every piece of media, every conversation, either contributes to your energy or drains it. This isn't about becoming isolated or judgmental. It's about recognizing that attention is your most precious resource and beginning to treat it that way. Before engaging, ask, does this usually leave me more centered or more scattered? The answer won't always determine your choice, but asking the question begins to shift the balance. Fourth, and most difficult, accept that becoming more yourself will make you less interesting to some people. When you no longer perform the roles they expected, when you no longer seek their approval, when you no longer react as you once did, some relationships will change or end. This isn't failure. It's clarification. The people who relate to your persona will lose interest in your presence. The people who relate to you will remain. And in the space created by this clarification, deeper connections become possible. A woman named Catherine described this process as she experienced it. For years, she had been the person everyone came to for advice, for support, for solutions. When she began to withdraw from this role, when she stopped being constantly available, some people expressed disappointment. A few stopped calling altogether. Catherine felt guilty, then lonely, then gradually peaceful. The peace surprised her. She realized she'd been carrying not just her own life, but pieces of everyone else's. Letting go of that weight didn't make her selfish. It made her real. The individuation journey doesn't produce a person who is more impressive by conventional standards. It produces a person who is more present, more grounded, more capable of genuine relationship, because they're no longer performing. And presence, genuine presence, has a quality that performance never achieves. It can be trusted. When your energy has returned to its source, when you've built the inner axis that Jung described, the things that once dominated your awareness begin to appear in proper proportion. They don't disappear. They just no longer fill the entire frame. You can remember without being consumed. You can acknowledge without being defined. You can encounter the past as past, not as an eternal present. The fear that arises at this stage is subtle. It's the fear of having lived so long off-center, of having wasted years on what didn't matter, of having been a stranger to yourself. This fear, if indulged, becomes regret. But regret is just another form of attachment. Attachment to a different past, a different story, a different version of what could have been. Letting go includes letting go of regret. Not because the past was perfect, but because you no longer need a perfect past to have a genuine present. There comes a moment, ordinary and unannounced, when you realize that something has shifted. You wake and the old preoccupation doesn't arrive. You go through your day and the familiar loop doesn't play. You encounter a reminder, and it's just a reminder, not a trigger. This realization may come with a kind of quiet astonishment, not because you fought so hard and won, but because you stopped fighting and simply became someone else. Conclusion: letting go, at its deepest level, is not an act of loss but of reclamation. You are not giving something up. You are taking yourself back. The energy that was scattered outward, invested in images, attached to roles, bound by habits, fearful of shadows, that energy returns to its source. And when it returns, you discover something you may never have known, that you were always more than what you were clinging to. The fear that accompanies genuine letting go is not fear of emptiness. It's fear of fullness, of the unfamiliar experience of being fully present, fully yourself, without the familiar distractions that once defined you. This fullness can feel like exposure because you're not hiding anymore. But exposure, when you're no longer ashamed of what's exposed, becomes simply being seen. And being seen, truly seen, is what you've always wanted. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. This privilege is not comfortable. It requires shedding skins, leaving roles, facing shadows, withdrawing from what never fit. But the discomfort is temporary. What remains is not. And one day, perhaps soon, you'll notice that what once held you has lost its grip. Not because you defeated it, but because you outgrew it. And outgrowing is the only letting go that lasts.